The ballroom was stunning. 12 crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, each one throwing diamonds of light across the walls. Round tables draped in white silk stretched across the marble floor, adorned with towering flower arrangements and gold-rimmed plates. Waiters in pressed black suits moved through the crowd like shadows, balancing trays of champagne without a sound. 500 people had gathered tonight for TechVision Global's 30th anniversary celebration. Investors, board members, tech journalists, politicians. All of them dressed in gowns and designer suits, laughing and clinking glasses over a legacy they believed they understood. Near the main entrance, half hidden by the shadow of a marble pillar, stood a man in a plain gray security uniform. He wasn't checking phones. He wasn't scanning faces for threats. He was just watching. His name was Marcus Webb. He was 61 years old, with silver at his temples and hands that had known hard work long before they ever knew a boardroom. His face was calm. Almost too calm for someone who was watching a party thrown in honor of everything that had been stolen from him. He had built this company. Every brick of it. Every line of code, every partnership, every impossible pitch to investors who wouldn't even take his calls at first. He had poured 30 years of his life into TechVision Global. And tonight, he was standing at the door in a security uniform that didn't belong to him. He hadn't come here to cause a scene. But before the night was over, the truth was going to walk through that door whether anyone was ready for it or not. Nobody becomes a founder by accident. Marcus Webb grew up in Baltimore, the third of 5 children, in a house where the heat sometimes cut off in February and dinner was whatever his mother could stretch. He wasn't bitter about it. He just learned early that the world didn't hand you anything, you built it yourself, or you went without. He discovered computers at 14 through a donated machine at his school library. Within a month, he was teaching himself programming from books he borrowed, renewed, and borrowed again. By 16, he had written his first working software, a simple scheduling program that his school principal actually used to organize the substitute teacher roster. Nobody celebrated it. But Marcus noticed something that day. He noticed the way a tool he had created made someone's problem disappear. That feeling never left him. He studied on scholarship. Graduated near the top of his class. Turned down 2 decent job offers because he didn't want to build someone else's dream. In 1994, in a rented garage in Baltimore, with 2 folding tables and 1 computer he'd assembled from parts, he started TechVision. The idea was simple. Elegant, even. Enterprise software that could communicate across incompatible systems, a bridge between platforms that large corporations desperately needed but couldn't build themselves. Marcus could see the problem clearly because he had studied it from every angle. He knew the solution because he had the kind of mind that didn't stop working, not even at 2 in the morning when he was surviving on coffee and peanut butter sandwiches. The first 3 years nearly killed him. There were weeks he couldn't make rent. Investors laughed at his projections. One man, a venture capitalist in a corner office, had looked him up and down during a pitch meeting and said, without embarrassment, "I just don't see the market for this kind of thing." Marcus had driven home that night, sat in his parked car for an hour, and then gone back to his garage and kept working. By 1999, TechVision was profitable. By 2003, it was growing faster than Marcus could manage alone. That was when he made the decision that would eventually cost him everything. He brought in outside help. His name was Derek Calloway. He arrived in Marcus's life through a mutual contact, presenting himself as a business development specialist with deep connections in the enterprise world. He wore expensive watches and spoke the language of boardrooms fluently. He had the kind of easy confidence that made people trust him before they had any reason to. Marcus was cautious at first. But Derek brought in 2 major contracts within his first 6 months, and the revenue was undeniable. So Marcus gave him more access. More authority. A seat at the table. Over the next several years, Derek systematically expanded his influence. He hired people who were loyal to him, not to Marcus. He cultivated relationships with board members that didn't include Marcus in the loop. He positioned himself as the practical voice in the room, the one who understood business, while quietly suggesting that Marcus was too idealistic, too emotional, too focused on the technical side to be leading a company of this size. Marcus noticed the drift. He raised it in private conversations. Derek always had a smooth answer. "You're the visionary, Marcus. I'm just keeping the lights on." What Marcus didn't know, what nobody told him, was that Derek had been quietly acquiring shares through shell companies. Building leverage. Preparing for a moment that Marcus never saw coming. That moment arrived in 2019, during a special board meeting Marcus hadn't been properly notified about. By the time Marcus found out, it was over. A stack of documents he had never signed. His signature, expertly forged, appeared on a transfer of equity and a voluntary resignation. The board, most of them either loyal to Derek or simply afraid of the legal machinery he had constructed, voted to ratify the change. Marcus stood in the hallway outside the boardroom and listened to the vote through a partially open door. He didn't make a sound. That silence, in the weeks that followed, would be mistaken for defeat. It wasn't "back to the ballroom." Back to the present. Marcus adjusted his collar and watched a waiter carry a tray of champagne toward a table near the center of the room. He had spent the last 5 years quietly. Rebuilding not his bank account, though that had suffered, but something more important. Evidence. Getting the security job had been easier than expected. The company that Tech Vision had contracted for tonight's event was run by an old friend, a man named Roland who had worked with Marcus in the early days and never forgotten who had given him his first real opportunity. Roland hadn't asked many questions when Marcus called. "I need to be inside that building tonight," Marcus had said. Roland had paused for exactly 3 seconds. "Uniform size?" Marcus smiled. "Large." Now he stood near the entrance, watching guests he recognized and guests he didn't, and waiting. He wasn't sure exactly when the moment would come. But he knew it would. Because in a sealed envelope locked inside the event coordinator's private office on the 2nd floor, there was a document that had taken him 5 years to locate, authenticate, and position exactly where it needed to be. He hadn't told anyone about the envelope. Not Roland. Not his daughter, Keisha, who had begged him not to come tonight. Not the attorney he had been working with quietly for the past 14 months. He had learned something from Derek Calloway. Sometimes the most powerful thing you could hold was information nobody knew you had. But nobody knew what was about to happen next. At precisely 7:45, the energy in the room shifted. It happened subtly, a slight straightening of spines near the main entrance, a turn of heads, a ripple of attention moving through the crowd. Marcus felt it before he saw it. Derek Calloway walked in like a man who owned the air around him. He was 60 now, with silver hair swept back cleanly and a charcoal suit that had probably cost more than Marcus's first car. He moved through the crowd the way powerful men do, slowly, making people come to him, offering handshakes and brief laughs and that practiced look of genuine interest that wasn't genuine at all. 3 men flanked him. 2 were private security, real security, not the contracted kind. The third was his personal assistant, a young man in his 20s who never looked up from his phone. Marcus watched Derek from across the room. For 5 years, he had imagined this moment. He had imagined anger. Rage, even. A hot rush of everything he had swallowed during those months after the board meeting, when lawyers were sending letters and the locks on his office had been changed and his name had been quietly removed from the company's official history. But standing here now, he didn't feel rage. He felt something steadier than that. Something that had been building for 5 years and had finally hardened into something unbreakable. Derek was 20 feet away now, accepting a glass of champagne, laughing at something a board member was saying. He hadn't looked in Marcus's direction. Why would he? There was no reason for the CEO of a billion-dollar company to notice a security guard by the door. That was the mistake. It happened 40 minutes later, near the entrance to the east corridor. Marcus had moved from his post, not dramatically, not obviously, just a natural shift in position that brought him closer to the hallway where the event coordinator's office was located. He needed to be near the envelope when the time was right. But Derek Calloway saw him first. Or rather, Derek saw a black man in a security uniform standing near a corridor that led to restricted areas, and he made a snap judgment the way certain men always do. "Hey!" Derek's voice cut across the ambient noise of the room. Sharp. Dismissive. Marcus turned slowly. Derek was walking toward him with his assistant at his heel and a board member, a man named Gerald Fitch, trailing behind. Derek's eyes did the thing they always did. A quick top-to-bottom assessment. A conclusion reached before a single word had been exchanged. "What are you doing over here?" Derek asked. "Guests aren't allowed in this corridor." "I know," Marcus said calmly. "I'm not a guest." Derek blinked. He wasn't used to calm. "I can see that," he said, his voice dropping to that particular register wealthy men use when they want to remind you of the distance between you. "I mean, what are you doing near this area?" "There's nothing back there that concerns security." "There's an office back there," Marcus said. "I was checking it." "It doesn't need checking." Derek turned to his assistant without waiting for a response. "Get me someone from the event management team. I want this man reassigned to the parking structure." Several guests nearby had gone quiet. The conversations closest to them had begun to drain away, replaced by the attentive silence of people who sense something interesting is about to happen. Marcus didn't move. "Sir," he said, and something in his tone made Derek look back at him, "I don't think you want to do this tonight." Derek Calloway smiled. It was the smile of a man who hadn't been challenged in so long that he found it almost amusing. "And why is that?" "Because," Marcus said quietly, "this is not your event to manage." The silence that followed was so complete that someone across the room lowered their champagne glass. Derek stared at him. "Get this man out of here," he said, to no one in particular. "Now." But no one moved. The two private security guards looked at each other. The event staff nearby exchanged uncertain glances. Because something was happening in the room that none of them could fully name, a shift in atmosphere, like the pressure drop before a storm. An older woman near the center of the room set her glass down and stood straighter. Her name was Patricia Osei. She had been TechVision's head of engineering from 2001 to 2018. She knew Marcus Webb the way you know the person who hired you, mentored you, and believed in your work before anyone else did. She had been studying the man in the security uniform for the past 20 minutes. Now she was certain. "Marcus," she said. Her voice wasn't loud but it carried. A few heads turned. Gerald Fitch, the board member who had been trailing behind Derek, went very still. Marcus turned toward Patricia's voice and the corner of his mouth lifted. Just slightly. Just enough. "Hello, Patricia." The murmur that ran through the nearby cluster of guests was instantaneous. A woman in a red gown leaned toward her companion and whispered something. Phones began appearing. Not conspicuously, just the quiet, instinctive reaching that happens when people sense they're witnessing something they'll want to remember. Derek Calloway looked from Marcus to Patricia and back again. "Does someone want to tell me what's happening?" he said, with a laugh designed to sound relaxed. It didn't land the way he intended. "You should probably know," Patricia said, walking closer, her voice steady and clear, "who you just tried to have removed from the building." "I don't care who he is," Derek said. "He's a security guard causing a disruption at my..." "He's the man who built this company," Patricia said. The silence this time was different. Harder. The kind of silence that has weight. Derek looked at Marcus. Really looked at him. And for the first time in 40 minutes, something behind his eyes flickered. Not recognition. Not guilt. Just the first shadow of uncertainty. That's insane, Derek said. Is it? Said Marcus. And then Marcus Webb walked past Derek Calloway toward the East Corridor, and nobody stopped him. The event coordinator's office was exactly where Marcus had confirmed it would be. He knocked twice. A young woman, early 30s, lanyard around her neck, the harried expression of someone managing 500 people and a catering emergency simultaneously, opened the door. "Mr. Webb," she said. "Is it still here?" Marcus asked. She nodded quickly and stepped aside. On the desk, between a walkie-talkie and a stack of seating charts, sat a sealed envelope. Cream-colored. No label. It looked ordinary. It looked like nothing. Marcus picked it up with both hands and stood very still for a moment. Inside this envelope was a notarized original copy of TechVision's founding documents, the actual originals, not the scanned versions Derek's lawyers had manipulated. Alongside them was a sworn affidavit from a forensic document examiner confirming that Marcus's signature on the 2019 resignation agreement was a forgery. And beneath that, a chain of title report showing the fraudulent structure of the shell companies Derek had used to quietly accumulate equity. Marcus had spent 14 months working with a team of attorneys and investigators to locate, authenticate, and preserve this evidence. He had spent another 4 months deciding exactly when and where to present it. He had chosen tonight deliberately. 500 witnesses. Cameras. Board members present. And Derek Calloway, who had made the catastrophic mistake of publicly humiliating the man he'd wronged, in a room full of people who would remember every second of it. Marcus tucked the envelope under his arm and walked back toward the ballroom. What happened next would change everything. When Marcus returned to the main hall, the crowd had rearranged itself around the developing scene the way crowds always do, gravitating toward tension without quite acknowledging that's what they're doing. Derek had attempted to regain control of the room. He was standing near the center with Gerald Fitch and 2 other board members, speaking in low, urgent tones. From the outside, it looked like a business conversation. From Marcus's angle, it looked like what it was. Panic. Patricia was still nearby, standing with a small group of former TechVision employees, people who had been with the company during its early years and had watched, over the past 5 years, as the version of TechVision they had built together became something else. Something colder. Something that didn't recognize them anymore. "You okay?" Patricia asked quietly as Marcus rejoined her. "I will be," he said. A journalist who covered the tech industry, a woman named Sandra Cho from a major outlet, had positioned herself just close enough to hear without being obvious about it. Her photographer was suddenly very interested in the architectural details of the east wall. Marcus set the envelope on a nearby table. Just set it down. Didn't open it. Didn't wave it around. Derek noticed. Of course he noticed. His eyes went to the envelope, then to Marcus's face, then away. "I'll have you arrested," Derek said, moving closer. His voice was low now, stripped of the performance. "I don't know what you think you have, but this is trespassing, and I will." "You'll what?" Marcus asked. Derek's jaw tightened. "I'll bury you," he said quietly. "I've done it before." The words hung in the air. And for one brief moment, Marcus felt the old weight of it, the years, the loss, the loneliness of fighting a battle nobody could see. For a moment, it almost felt like it always had. Like Derek was going to win again. But that moment passed. Because Marcus Webb had not come here to fight. He had come here to finish. "Could I have everyone's attention, please?" The voice didn't belong to Marcus. It came from the main entrance, a measured, professional voice that carried authority without effort. 3 people had entered the ballroom while the room's attention had been focused on the scene near the east corridor. The first was a woman in a dark suit carrying a briefcase. The second was a man Marcus recognized as a senior partner from one of Washington, D.C.'s most respected corporate law firms. The third was someone who made Gerald Fitch take a full step backward. It was a representative from the state attorney general's office. The woman with the briefcase walked directly to Marcus and took the envelope from the table beside him. She opened it, removed the documents, and placed them in a separate folder that had been prepared in advance. "What is this?" Derek demanded. His voice had lost something. The smoothness was gone. "My name is Claire Okafor," the woman said. "I represent Marcus Webb in the matter of Webb vs. Callaway and the TechVision Global Board. These documents have been authenticated and submitted as part of an active legal proceeding. What you're witnessing tonight is not a confrontation, Mr. Callaway. It's a notification." "Of what?" Derek said. Claire Okafor looked at him with the calm of someone who had been waiting a long time for this moment. "That effective as of 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, a court order will be executed freezing all shares and assets connected to the 2019 transfer agreement, pending a full fraud investigation by the Attorney General's office." The room did not erupt. It went completely silent. Someone dropped a fork and the sound rang out like a bell. Gerald Fitch sat down heavily in the nearest chair. The two board members beside him took out their phones simultaneously, calling, Marcus assumed, their own lawyers. Derek Callaway stood in the center of the room and, for the first time in 30 years, had absolutely nothing to say. Marcus walked toward him slowly. Not with anger. Not with triumph. Just with the quiet steadiness of a man who had carried something heavy for a very long time and had finally set it down. "I didn't come here to humiliate you," Marcus said. He stopped about 3 feet away, close enough to be heard clearly, too far for it to feel like aggression. "I came here because this is where it started. In rooms like this one, I made every pitch, signed every deal, and built everything you've been living off of for the last 5 years." He paused. "I wanted you to look at me when it ended. Not in a courtroom. Not through a lawyer. Here. Where you could see me clearly." Derek's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "Tonight," Marcus said, "you called me a security guard and tried to have me thrown out of my own building. I want you to remember that when you're explaining yourself to the court." He turned and walked away. Behind him, Sandra Cho's photographer was no longer pretending to study the architecture. The next several months unfolded quickly by legal standards, though they felt anything but quick to the people living through them. The forensic document analysis confirmed what Marcus's team had spent 14 months establishing: his signature on the 2019 voluntary resignation and equity transfer had been forged. Expert testimony from 2 independent examiners was unambiguous on the point. The shell company structure Derek had used to acquire shares was traced through financial records that his own attorneys had underestimated Marcus's legal team's ability to subpoena. Gerald Fitch was the first to cooperate with investigators. He had been present at the board meeting where the fraudulent documents were ratified, and faced with the evidence, his attorney negotiated a cooperation agreement within 3 weeks. His testimony detailed the pressure campaign Derek had run against board members who might have raised objections, the implied threats, the financial incentives, the careful manipulation of information that had made the illegal vote feel, to those present, like a procedural formality. 2 other board members followed Fitch's lead shortly after. Derek Callaway's legal team fought hard. They were expensive and skilled, and they raised procedural objections that delayed proceedings several times. But the core evidence was simply too strong. The forged signatures, the shell companies, the testimony from people who had been in the room. On a Thursday morning 11 months after the ballroom confrontation, Derek Callaway entered a guilty plea to charges of corporate fraud and forgery. He agreed to relinquish all fraudulently obtained assets, including his shares in TechVision Global. He was sentenced to 4 years, reduced to 2 with conditions, and permanently barred from serving as an officer or director of any publicly traded company. The shares, and with them controlling interest in TechVision, were returned to Marcus Webb. On the morning the court order was signed, Marcus sat alone in the small apartment he had lived in for the past 5 years, a 2-bedroom place that was a long way from the house he'd once owned, and held the document in both hands. He didn't cry. He had done his crying years ago, in private, in moments he hadn't let anyone see. He just sat quietly and thought about the garage in Baltimore. The folding tables. The second-hand computer. The years when no one believed in what he was building except him. He thought about how far all of it had traveled to arrive at this piece of paper in his hands. Then he set it down, stood up, and called his daughter. "Keisha," he said when she answered. She already knew. She had been following the case alert on her phone. "Dad," she said. And then she couldn't say anything else for a moment. Neither could he. 6 months later, Marcus Webb walked through the front doors of TechVision Global's headquarters for the first time in 5 years. He wasn't in a security uniform. He wore a dark blue jacket and carried a leather portfolio that had been a gift from Patricia Osei, who had agreed to return to the company as Chief Technology Officer. The lobby had been renovated in the years he'd been gone, new floors, new lighting, a different configuration to the reception desk. But the original TechVision logo, the one Marcus had sketched on a napkin in 1994, was still mounted on the wall behind the entrance. Nobody had gotten around to replacing it. Or maybe nobody had wanted to. He stood in front of it for a moment. Just a moment. The receptionist, a young man who hadn't been born yet when Marcus started this company, looked up and said, "Good morning. Do you have an appointment?" Marcus smiled. "I live here," he said. And then he walked in. There is a version of this story where Marcus Webb never fights back. Where he accepts what was taken from him and finds peace somewhere else, in something smaller, in a life remade from the wreckage of betrayal. That would have been understandable. Many people do exactly that. The weight of fighting something this large, for this long, against people with this many resources, most people would have broken under it. Marcus didn't break. Not because he was made of different material than everyone else. But because he had learned something in that garage in Baltimore, on all those nights with cold coffee and borrowed library books and an idea that nobody else could see yet. He had learned that the things worth building take longer than you expect, cost more than you planned, and require you to keep going past the point where stopping would be reasonable. He had learned that some things only look like endings. Sometimes they're just the last part before the door opens. Derek Calloway had stood in that ballroom and looked at a man in a security uniform and seen nothing worth his attention. He had seen what he expected to see, and nothing more, and it had cost him everything. Marcus Webb had stood in that same ballroom and seen exactly what he had come to see. The finish line. And some lessons, the real ones, the ones that stay with you, have a way of arriving publicly, in rooms full of witnesses, right at the moment you least expect them.